Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on what all lawyers need to know about cannabis. I said this during our prep session, but I think maybe a missed opportunity that we didn't start this program at 4:20. But here we are at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Going to have a good conversation today. We got a great panel. And I just want to let you know that there's a couple of resources available to you. We have a handout, which is going to be in the resources tab. So check that out. And then we'll also have a link for you to some further information, which is going to be a message that pops up for you in the viewer. Anybody have any questions about that, just pop those into the chat. The other thing I'll say is we're going to talk about a lot of things today, but we can make this an interactive discussion. We've got enough content to just talk and have us be talking heads for an hour. But if folks have questions, pop them into the chat area and we'll thread those into the conversation if they're good questions. So make sure you ask good questions. Today, as I said, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're calling this our cannabis overview, and we've got really four things that we're going to try to focus on in this session. One is the growth of the cannabis industry and the effects that have. Two is the 280E problem, including tax risks. Three is risks in the transactions, including banking risks and facilitators. And last, we're going to talk about IP and merger and acquisition issues. So I'll introduce myself briefly, and then we'll introduce the panel. My name is Jared Correia. I'm a business management consultant for law firms. Been doing that for about 15 years. I have a company called Red Cave Law Firm Consulting. So talk with a lot of attorneys. And now let's get our panelists to introduce themselves so I can stop talking. And we'll start with Nathalie. Nathalie, you're up first. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll get through the rest of the roster.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nathalie Bougenies. I'm with the law firm of Harris Bricken. We're an international boutique law firm that focuses on cannabis law. And for the past 3 years, I have chaired the Hemp Practice Group and work primarily with distributors and retailers of hemp-derived finished products, but certainly have some decent understanding of cannabis law in general, and I'm really looking forward to being on this panel today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nathalie. You noticed I didn't pronounce your last name on purpose. You did such a good job with it. Next, let's move to Sahar. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sahar Ayinehsazian. I'm one of the partners at Vicente Sederberg. Vicente Sederberg is a national cannabis law firm. My practice at VS focuses on corporate transactions, and I also co-chair our banking and financial services department. So I get to see all the fun stuff happening.
Excellent. Next up is Lauren, who, like me, is doing a webinar today with children afoot. So if there are any screams, that's probably coming from our screens.
I do apologize in advance for my COVID-exposed 10-month-old. Lauren Rudick. I am a partner at Hiller PC. I co-founded the Cannabis Law Practice. My practice is mostly startups and investors in the cannabis industry. We're very, very focused right now on licensing in both New York and New Jersey. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm also treasurer and on the board of directors for the International Cannabis Bar Association, an excellent organization that I would recommend every attorney interested in cannabis join. I'm also vice chair of cannabis law and policy of the American Bar Association. I am on the board of directors for an organization called Breeders Best, which is a record label style of unique cannabis genetics. And I also write for Marijuana Venture magazine, which is a gig I've had for about 6 years. But super excited to meet these other attorneys on the panel. I have been, sort of watching your practices develop over years, much more sophisticated than what we've got going on in New York. We're all learning from you. So, very excited to have this, national perspective today.
Lauren, you sound like a good person to know. Now, last but not least, we got Jeff Samuels, whose last name I can definitely pronounce, from Embroker. So, Jeff, why don't you take a moment to intro yourself?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jared. Yeah, Jeff Samuels. I am the vice president of Cannabis Practice at Embroker. Proudly have been operating and servicing clients in the space for almost 7 years now. Fun side note, Lauren was one of the first people I met in the industry and obviously a phenomenal connection. very much a student of the industry and have fallen in love with the business in general. And beyond insurance, I have done some investments in the space. I'm involved in an operator in New Jersey, which was recently licensed. And so I like to kind of bring the totality of my experience in cannabis and apply that when I'm servicing on the insurance side.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeff. And kudos to you on the space. Looks very comfortable where you are. Let's jump into it. And before we do that, let me remind you, you got those resources to check out, and also keep those questions coming in. Get some good questions coming in. This is a great time to ask the questions, your burning questions of a great panel like this. So let's do it in the same order we just did. I'm going to start with Nathalie. So I think everybody knows cannabis industry is booming right now. Looking forward to eventual federal legalization. And what's also interesting is that an industry that started out with a lot of startup companies coming in, testing things out, now you've got some big players entering the field. So Nathalie, can you talk about the current state of the industry from your perspective?
I mean, like I said, my focus has been on hemp for the last couple of years. And so that particular crop has been legal at the federal level. So in that sense, it's not so new. And
yes,
I think
not as new for you.
Exactly. But we're still dealing with the issue of finished products that are not deemed lawful by the FDA. And so that's, I think in the hemp space, federal legalization really has more to do with changing some of these laws and regulations that would pressure the FDA to act in regulating these finished products. But I think your question, maybe we're better off spending more time on marijuana and turning to other panelists, because I think that that's really at the core of your question. So,
oh, sure. That's totally fine. Lauren, let's move to you.
Just in terms of, the broader scope, we're certainly seeing the vast majority of individuals in the United States live in a jurisdiction in which some form of cannabis is legal. The vast majority of Americans believe in the liberalization and legalization of cannabis to some degree. Certainly for medical purposes, I think, 98% of the country agrees on medical purposes. You can't get 98% of the country to agree on anything ever. And then many people, increasingly so, are believing in the expungement of all marijuana-related crimes and, certainly descheduling cannabis, from the Controlled Substances Act and not having it be regulated as a controlled substance at all. So a lot of pressure across the board, multiple, as states come online, the legalization in California, I mean, we're talking about the 5th largest economy in the world, that has cannabis legal. So how much longer can the federal government really hold out? There's just tremendous pressure. And with New York going this year, I mean, that's like the 8th largest economy in the world, so just, the pressure is on. But, at the very same time, it's important we do it right. There's just no way that people should be, continuing to persist in the legal system, while people are making millions of dollars. So I think that we really need to focus the industry on, the social justice reform, because the legal industry will not survive, if it can't compete effectively with illicit markets and other, types of forces that are driving legal markets into the ground. We're seeing a lot of shakeup in Colorado and California, and so I think it's very important that we have a regulated system that works so that people use it. And so hopefully we're seeing increasing sophistication on state programs as they come online. New York has some very ambitious goals. Fingers crossed that we get it right. Certainly learning from what's happened in other states. But I think, just very broad strokes. And of course, everything is different on a state-by-state basis. But we are seeing progressive moves being made. And hopefully it's leading to, very broad liberalization, legalization of cannabis across the board.
Excellent. Thanks, Lauren. Now let's turn to Sahar. And you can talk a little bit about the legalization piece of it also, but you can also feel free to address what it's like for new players coming into the industry as well. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking really at the arc of where the industry has been moving, it's definitely a lot more mainstream. Like Lauren said, it's a lot more accepted. There is a place and a product in the industry now for really everyone of any kind of taste, be it, the soccer mom, what we tend to look at as like the old school stoner, the student and whatnot. And I think that has had a tremendous amount of impact on the fact that it's so nationally accepted now. You have bipartisan support really for legalization, you have bipartisan support on the banking side of things. So I think that, we're really moving forward, but we also have a lot more left to do. I think during COVID saw that cannabis is a really staple part of a lot of states and localities' economies and can come in and supplement where other portions of an economy are kind of downtrending. And so that, I think, also further adds to the national recognition of it. And I think for newcomers in this space, there are more opportunities in some ways and also fewer opportunities in others. I think the opportunity to come in and perhaps look at various funding opportunities and look at various pockets that they can put themselves into and audiences that they can really cater to. There's greater opportunity there, but also there are certain markets that are becoming a little bit more saturated, especially mature ones, for example, like the Colorado market or the Oregon market. And so it's about finding the opportunities that fit best now for those newcomers and recognizing where they want to fit in and how they can make that happen for themselves.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I like your point about that being a stable part of the economy when several parts of the economy are less than stable right now. Jeff, let's turn to you. What's your take on the current state of the industry?
Yeah, I think, the last 2 weeks in particular has been extremely interesting. And I think in general, those of us who've been working in the industry for a while, this business operates in dog years. And so things are moving super fast. And so for new entrants into the business, just to be able to read the trades on a daily basis is critical. And so from the business side and the corporate side, there was one of the biggest M&A transactions to date in the cannabis business last week with Cresco and Columbia Care. There was a big acquisition out of New York with one of the legacy licenses there, their brands being bought. And so all of this kind of leads to business complexities and opportunities. And again, I am based on the East Coast, and I've proudly, with Lauren and other people, have been waiting for New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and even with Mass and Pennsylvania making some noise in positive ways. It's a super exciting time. But I think the biggest thing for me when I'm looking at like what's most recent on my desk today, it's really the consolidation and what's happening with both the biggest players in the industry. And at the same time, if you look at a market like New York and New Jersey, there's the smaller. And so I think it will play out like how those consolidate and how those two, the smaller micro businesses, the social equity businesses, and the MSOs coexist. So I'm excited to see how that plays out in the future. And there's just a ton of information to dig into. And again, I think 6 years in the business, it's dog years. So there's a lot of stuff that has changed and evolved. And it's, obviously it's a ride. So.
All right, Jeff, stick around. Our next topics are going to cover risk. And for a guy who's an insurance company, that would be right up your alley. But before we do that, I got a question from the audience that I want to direct to Nathalie. So, Nathalie, Danielle is asking, have you been involved in international hemp transactions? And how does that differ from national transactions? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have, and it is an even more complex issue in that not only are you dealing with the laws of the US, you're also dealing with the laws of other nations. And so I guess the question specify whether or not I've been dealing with import or export, because obviously these two activities are quite different. And I don't know, I mean, I can touch on both really if the person doesn't have a specific.
Let's do it. Let's touch on it. Let's get crazy. Let's try both.
Okay. Well, let's start with importing because that really touches on US law. And so importing hemp, raw hemp is fairly easy at this point in time because really all that needs to be shown is that you're dealing with an agricultural crop that meets the US laws, which is essentially that the crop doesn't contain more than 0.3% total THC. And you do that by having COAs, that show the test results, but also by showing chain of title to prove that the hemp was cultivated lawfully in the country of origin. Occasionally, we have seen some issues when helping international clients at the border because while I think that there is a better understanding now at the federal government as to the legality of hemp, and by hemp, I mean just the plant, right? I'm not talking about finished products yet. I'll touch on that in a second. The problem is that we're still dealing with people at the border who are not as educated as they should be. And obviously, hemp looks and smells very much like marijuana. So the first intuition, I think, for custom agents, if they're not well versed on these issues, is to just look at whatever is in a container if they're conducting an inspection. And if they're testing the crop to assess whether or not the level of THC is in compliance with US law, well, the tools that we have available right now are only allowing them to assess whether or not THC is present, which of course is not helpful because there is THC in most hemp strains. So you're going to essentially test positive. And so we have seen a few clients see their crops be held. Some of them, they've been destroyed. But again, I think that there are ways now in being strategic as to where you're importing your hemp. More hemp-friendly states, for instance, where custom agents are better versed on these issues are the way to go. So that's for raw hemp. And then when we're talking about finished products, that's a lot trickier because, as I touched on earlier, the FDA deems that most finished products, particularly consumable ingestibles, so food products and dietary supplements, cannot be lawfully sold and marketed in this country. And I'm not going to go into details as to why. Basically, sure. You know, it has to do with pre-market approval and the fact that CBD was first approved as a drug ingredient. But all that to say that because of the FDA's position, no one can lawfully, in theory, can lawfully import finished products that contain hemp because the CBP follows other agencies' rules and regulations, and they turn to the FDA when it comes to these finished products. Now, we've seen that with cosmetics, obviously it's a lot more feasible because generally speaking, cosmetics are not as regulated in this country. Same thing with hemp extract. So again, you need to understand what you're trying to import and what those federal laws are. And if it's allowed, then generally speaking, it's fairly feasible. Now, exporting can be more challenging in other ways. So the US doesn't care so much about the legality of a product that leaves the US. CBP is not going to check generally what these products are, although you certainly do not want to export substances that are illegal. But the main concern really, especially if you're trying to export hemp or finished products that are lawful, is to ensure that the crop and or the finished products are lawful under the foreign laws to which you're shipping these products. So it's the same exercise as what you would do in assessing whether or not you can import products, but you have to basically work with attorneys in those jurisdictions to make sure that everything aligns. And it's not just about the legality of the products, it's about tariffs, it's about seeing whether or not you need to receive permits in advance. So it is a complex endeavor, but one that's absolutely feasible if you're working with a law firm or with attorneys that have experience in that sphere.
Very thorough, very lawyerly answer. I'm impressed. So
well, I'm a lawyer,
Nathalie, should work out that way, right? We got a follow-up question on this for you. How about is there interaction with the Lacey Act on any of this stuff? Does that ring a bell to you?
It does not.
Okay. All right. If you ask the question about the Lacey Act, specify a little bit more and we can get that answered. Now, I got another question from the chat, which is kind of interesting. So Ezra asks, what are your thoughts on New York State's requirement that cannabis businesses must be co-founded by a person with a prior conviction, and what legal issues does that present? This sounds like something that we may be able to start off with Jeff. Jeff, you have thoughts on this?
Sure. Yeah, it's I will first of all, I'd say Lauren's firm, and just based on my knowledge, she is extremely close to this. But I think this is part of the social equity opportunity, and really just understanding kind of the core of cannabis, and kind of why in the last 5 years businesses have evolved and are having opportunities in the space. So I think, again, if you look at why states are moving towards legalization, beyond the tax revenue, there are obviously social justice issues that need to be solved. There are years of systematic, racism and just all sorts of negative things that cannabis has been associated with. And I think for New York, looking at the surrounding states and just other states who have rolled out programs first, it is important for New York to prioritize social equity and make sure they're giving people the opportunity that they deserve. So it's a complex question. That's kind of my simplistic take on it. I think it's deeper. I'd love to hear Lauren's take on it as well.
All right, you've teed up Lauren. Lauren, take it away.
Well, there's so much to talk about here, but for sure it's controversial. New York took this very progressive move, and for the very first time in an unprecedented fashion, granted first bite at the retail apple to social equity applicants. We've certainly seen social equity applicants in other markets have first bite at specialized licenses like delivery or social use in Massachusetts, and in California, there are certainly some municipalities where social equity have a lot of priority in licensing, on retail. But on a statewide measure, this is very unique and special. But there is a lot of question as to whether social equity and priority programs, how they're working, or do they really actually, ultimately end up re-stigmatizing the very people that are stigmatized as a result of failed drug policy. They create systems where people can game, the system. And we see a lot of predatory behavior, unfortunately by multi-state operators and even, other unscrupulous investors, trying to take advantage of the benefits and priorities that, people who might have less business sophistication, otherwise would be entitled to. Sort of taking advantage of their need for capital to be able to get a priority application in, or enable to, ensure that they have whatever is necessary to qualify for eligibility. And in this particular case with the social equity licenses in New York, the eligibility criteria was drawn very, very narrow, and very intentionally, which begs a lot of questions as to whether, there was sort of a preconceived group of individuals and prospective operators that they sort of drew this program around. And it's a very unique program because the state anticipates providing what they say is going to be a turnkey dispensary. So they're obviously looking for stewards of the state's money here, somebody who could potentially, give a return, back to the state. They're going to be getting financed through a private public fund that's run through the dormitory authority. So it's actually a debt facility. I don't believe it to be actual grants or an equity interest or something like that. So, the eligibility criteria, a conviction, is very narrow. Anybody involved in criminal defense knows that a marijuana conviction is kind of hard. A lot of people, they get arrested, they might plea out, but getting convicted for a marijuana offense, a New York marijuana offense, while you are a New York resident, does definitely narrow eligibility quite significantly. So no arrests, no pleas, no out-of-state crimes, no federal crimes. And if you weren't a resident of New York at the time, then that's also would defeat your eligibility. And then this justice involved individual, it has to be the person, the applicant, or an immediate family member, or a dependent, or they have to be a dependent of somebody of, who is this justice involved. And then the second criteria is business sophistication. So I sort of alluded to that earlier. So it's not just the previous conviction, but you also have to have business sophistication, meaning that you had to have been at least a 10% owner of a business that was profitable for at least 2 years of its existence. So that is also a challenge. We're talking with people, who have suffered many collateral consequences associated with their conviction, making it very difficult for them to operate a profitable business. And there are some businesses like restaurants, for example, that are almost intentionally designed to operate at a loss. And so it's very challenging to sort of understand how they drew this criteria. And then we can have, very successful individuals that have supported the growth of very successful organizations, but never had an ownership stake, but nonetheless would be excellent stewards of the social equity program. So some very big questions that we're asking to the state right now. We would love, a little bit more guidance. Now is the time to be engaging in rulemaking. It's open to public comment. So, our thoughts on the matter are certainly being submitted. We look forward to seeing how this play out. We're very hopeful, and we definitely are very proud of our Office of Cannabis Management for putting equity first. But we really need to make sure that this is rolled out in the right way. So I'm looking forward to see how that happens.
Great, thank you. Now we're getting some questions in the chat about banking and financing. So let's turn to that subject. Let's talk first about banking risks involved, as well as the use of facilitators. Anybody want to take this one first? Sahar, are you comfortable jumping in on this? I was going to say, you raised your hand even, and you've been quiet for a while. So why don't you kick us off here? Then we'll get to some of the follow-up questions.
I have been, tomorrow actually is my 6-year anniversary of being in the cannabis space, and I entered it through banking, and actually a third-party platform that really sought to ameliorate the banking issues in cannabis. And I'll give a 30,000-foot view of it that'll kind of, bleed into what the banking issues are now, what facilitators are trying to do, and where we are as an industry with respect to that. So, simply put, because cannabis is still a Schedule I substance, it creates a lot of risks and issues for financial institutions, banks, obviously, and credit unions to take on cannabis businesses. In 2014, FinCEN, an arm of the Department of Treasury, came out with a memorandum that had, certain red flags on it, reiterated the enforcement priorities of the Cole memo, had 3 types of suspicious activity reports on it, and that those few pages continue to really remain the cornerstone of cannabis banking. In the last few years or so, we've seen a growth in cannabis banking in that there are more and more financial institutions that are willing to take on either cannabis or cannabis-related businesses, but banking is still not where it should be. I think the last FinCEN report was somewhere just under 1,000 financial institutions taking on cannabis and cannabis-related businesses, and it's still very costly, in large part because of the due diligence that goes into taking on a cannabis or cannabis-related businesses. So this creates then a pocket for facilitators to come in and either kind of take the place of what a depository institution would do or facilitate that relationship. We also have the issue of merchant processing, credit and debit cards, which, although we've seen a fair amount of movement on the banking side, the credit and the debit processing continues to be a pain point, in large part because, simply put, the major credit card networks have made it very clear for the last few years, and this stance has not changed, that they do not want cannabis-related transactions on their platforms. This brings about the need to have creative means of processing so that, cash isn't the only way to pay at a retail spot, but it is kind of like, whack-a-mole, where someone will come up with a solution that they think works fantastically, and then Visa, MasterCard, or the affiliated financial institutions will come in and say, nope, that doesn't work. Or someone will come up with something that looks like it works well, and then it turns out behind the scenes there are a lot of regulatory issues, and state banking regulators will come and shut that down immediately. And so, with respect to finding a financial institution, it's my opinion that if you do a little bit of research, if you consult your attorneys, it is possible to find that and not have to turn to a third-party intermediary. With respect to processing, it's really, really important to do your homework. Consult with an attorney who understands how these things work and what the various risks are, ranging from, being blacklisted and not being able to get merchant capabilities ever again, to potentially losing the money that you have with that processor. And understand that you have to weigh the potential risks versus the potential possibilities for your business, but that it continues to be a gray area at best. And so there's no, from what I've seen, foolproof merchant processing possibility. And anyone that tells you this is risk-free, this is going to work out perfectly, you're never going to have an issue, it's going to be like, when you go to the shoe store and you swipe your card, chances are they're not being wholly truthful. So.
Great. Okay. So I got 2 quick questions from the chat to follow up with for you, and then we're going to open up the discussion to everybody. We got a very specific question about risks associated with dispensaries that are using cashless ATMs now that Visa has cautioned against it. Oh, so look, that face you made tells me this is an important issue. So why don't you address that?
Okay, so to understand the issue of cashless ATM, one needs to understand the very basic manner in which card processing works. And so simply put, for any business to be able to have merchant processing, they need to have what is known as a merchant category code, an MCC. And an MCC basically says this card swipe is being used for pastries, is being used for X services and whatnot. There is absolutely no MCC code in the United States that is affiliated with cannabis. You cannot use the medical codes. You cannot use the pharmacy codes. You cannot use the miscellaneous store codes. People have attempted that, and you can't. And so another one of the codes that has been attempted to be used is the cashless ATM code, essentially, which is when you go into a dispensary and you're buying something for $63.52 and they tell you we have to charge you for $65 or $70 and you get the rest back in cash. Technically, the cashless ATM MCC is correct for the immediate transaction, but because it is a part of an overall cannabis purchase, it's not the proper code to be used, and it's still an attempt to get around the major credit card networks' rules on not processing cannabis-related transactions. And so for this reason, Visa came out with really a reminder of you can't miscode what you're doing just because the immediate transaction, for example, may be related to that MCC. And so my advice, and I tend to take a very, very conservative view on cannabis processing, just because of everything I've seen happen in the last 6 years, is just don't do it, especially because we now have like black and white writing from one of the 3 major networks of you cannot do this. This is not okay. And the networks, when it comes to cannabis, tend to really echo one another. So just because, for example, like American Express, MasterCard hasn't come out with something like this yet, doesn't mean that they don't share the same viewpoint. They just may be waiting to get their header right for the memo that comes out, frankly. So.
All right, Sahar, last one for you. Give me 60 seconds on whether you think this changes if there is cannabis legalization regarding the reputation risk and whether or not a bank is willing to work with a provider.
Okay.
Does that make
So reputational risk has been one of the major issues that financial institutions have had when it comes to taking on cannabis, because financial institutions do not like risk. They tend to be very conservative, and they don't love to branch out into, more questionable territories. I will say that back in 2016, 17, maybe even 18, the reputational risk that came with taking on a cannabis-related client was larger, higher, more formidable than it is nowadays. I would say since 2019-ish and onward, especially actually as a result of COVID, we have seen that responsible cannabis businesses are actually a very solid and staple part of their communities. Sorry about that. They tend to provide security for the community because, they're mandated by the regulations to do so. They tend to be very responsible. They tend to have solid hiring practices with respect to the community. And so because of our ability to see the realities of cannabis, because we've seen that they tend to become major parts of the economy of a community and of a state overall, and because of the bipartisan support that we've seen come into cannabis, that reputational risk for financial institutions has actually been lowered. So they tend to be a little bit less worried. I think back in 2016, actually, there was a survey in Oregon that showed that the majority of clients for a bank or for any other financial institution would prefer for that bank or for that credit union to take on a cannabis business rather than, say, like a pharmaceutical company or a big box company. So we're seeing the issue of reputational risks become lower. And I think that once we have legalization take place, because it will have followed about a decade of cannabis legalization in various states, and really showing that cannabis businesses are good parts of the community, it'll become even lower. And hopefully at one point, we'll see it not even really be a factor anymore. Sorry if that was more than 60 seconds.
It was way more than 60 seconds, but very informative. So take a break, hydrate, turn off the fire alarm, whatever it is that's happening. And then we're going to go to, I think, Jeff next. Let's do the lightning round. Let's do it for real. 60 seconds on financial ramifications so we can get to these other topics. Jeff.
I just learned a ton, Sahar. That was amazing. So thank you. And I think that if you go to a dispensary I have a medical card in Connecticut, and I go to a GTI dispensary, and the point of sale changes monthly or quarterly. And I think that the only other comment I would make, just from like a risk perspective, when you're dealing with any sort of point of sale, and like caveat, there's super cool technology at that level that connects the seed to sale, the point of sale inventory. So that's a whole nother part of the business that is amazing and really exciting. From a risk standpoint, you have the opportunity to be hacked, and there's sensitive data, sensitive information there. The flip side of that, on the cash side, I have had several clients have cash stolen from their facilities in vaults and things like that. So it's a problem in the business. I think Sahar, her statements were phenomenal, and that's the information I would focus on. But yeah, it's tricky part of the business for sure.
All right, let's do one quick follow-up because we got this in the chat just now. Jeff, I'm going to ask this to you, and then I'll move to Lauren, who can answer this, and then give her general thoughts. Are there sectors of the banking industry that are more easily able to work with the cannabis industry, like credit unions, for example? And are there regulatory advantages for going there? Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, like live example for my team, my business in Jersey. Yes, there are credit unions that have evolved and have learned throughout the years, especially started in places like Colorado, Pacific Northwest. And again, we're seeing them kind of capitalize that on the East Coast now. The credit unions and local state banks are offering large debt lines of credit and just new financial tools that we have not seen. And so those are really excellent opportunities. And I think if you look at the biggest companies in the space, that's who they're banking with. I won't really speak to the regulatory side of it, but yes, from a credit union and local bank standpoint, there are a ton of them. Somebody wants to take that cash because these companies are throwing off millions of dollars of revenue, and somebody's going to bank it. And it most definitely is happening on the local level.
Jeff, we're getting lots of questions on financing in the chat, so we're giving the people what we want. How about crypto as an option at point of sale?
Again, I've heard it conceptually. I have not seen it effectively work in practice. So I think it's a bigger question. I don't think either industry is mature enough for it to work seamlessly yet. I would not be shocked if in the near future, it's part of the ecosystem. But I think it goes back to the point of sale technology, a lot of the points that Sahar was talking about in terms of the credit card providers allowing you to do that, or however you can transact that. So not yet, but I think in the future, somebody will figure it out. I necessarily haven't seen it. I'm curious if the other panelists have.
Yeah, and I just want to say that Ezra said that, Jeff, you and Lauren knocked it out of the park on the question about that New York issue. So kudos to you. But I think everybody's knocking it out of the park. All right, Lauren, let's hear your thoughts on the grab bag of financial topics we've been addressing.
Well, I mean, it's notable to go back to banking and just talk about what's happening on more macro level. Really interestingly, definitely, you mentioned the credit unions, the state chartered banks, any bank that isn't taking federal dollars or federally insured, those are the ones that are more likely to transact business with cannabis businesses. And it's definitely, we represent a lot of hemp companies too. And sometimes it's just a matter of educating your prospective banker and letting them know the difference between a product that's federally legal versus a product that isn't federally legal. And just sort of understanding a little bit about where the money is coming from. And I heard a very compelling presentation by Sunday Seafried, who was, a very big banking personality, represented one of the big Colorado, or was the CEO of one of the very first Colorado banks to start transacting business with cannabis businesses, and really fiercely defended, banking cannabis businesses. And she explained that, the dispensary is really the easiest of the licensed entities to bank. Because of the degree of seed to sale tracking and the cash management that goes into a dispensary, whereas you have, earlier in the production and particularly in financing transactions, you never know where that money has come from. And it could come from a variety of different sources, and it's very difficult to track. And, it's sort of, the dispensary becomes the easiest to manage from a due diligence perspective, and in terms of auditing and making sure that, when they have to file their suspicious activity reports, that it's an easier exercise for them to deal with. Because like Sahar mentioned, they're averse to risk, and they're also lazy, and they don't particularly want to do a lot of work, a lot of due diligence, and they don't like to do a lot of paperwork with the bank secrecy. So sort of telling a banker, the money's already in the banking system. This is just being used. You're not going to receive a lot of cash transactions, or this is sort of, it really depends on where you are in the supply chain, and you can probably present a very compelling case to a banker, who might be on the fence of taking your money or not. But like Jeff said, there's so much money. There's a lot of revenue here for these businesses, and we're starting to see banks really sharpen their pencils to compete for that business, particularly in places like New Jersey and in Massachusetts. Where banks are starting to give construction loans and mortgages on land transactions. We're even starting to see maybe even a little operational cash, for people who are more ancillary, very exciting on the banking front, and those transactions are crossing state lines. Some of the operators that are having difficulty getting financing in Massachusetts are looking to New Jersey banks, knowing, that they're openly banking licensed entities. Very difficult to get one before you have a license, unless it's a land transaction or something else. But once you're licensed, banks are pretty eager, to bank your dollars. So definitely seeing, liberalization of banks, specialty banks, in the Amish community in Pennsylvania is where we went for, banking in Pennsylvania, represent a medical dispensary there. But it's starting to get increasingly attractive. I do believe we're going to see some major, token-backed, blockchain-backed initiatives this year. We're definitely starting to see it shape up on the social equity funding front. We're seeing, some groups sort of cobble together with initiatives to find, microloans and things like that to social equity businesses. So lots of different sources of capital. Hopefully, create some competition, and get these banks to start more meaningfully participate, because I think there's just going to be a ton of money for them.
Excellent. Nathalie, do you have any thoughts on this from the hemp side of the house?
Very quickly. Just from a hemp perspective, the challenge when it comes to banks is really that even though hemp is an agricultural commodity, it can quickly turn into marijuana because of THC fluctuations. And so a lot of clients I've worked with who have dealt with bank issues had to do with the fact that these banks were very concerned about being able to monitor whether or not something that was lawfully cultivated eventually turns into a controlled substance. And so one of the ways, like Lauren said, is to educate these banks and to put mechanisms into place, such as providing COAs on a regular basis, and basically showing these financial institutions that their clients are in compliance with all applicable laws. Of course, it's very tedious and burdensome for the industry, but at least the hemp industry has been able to do that to a certain extent. The other thought that I have about banking and payment processors in general, especially payment processors, it's very relevant in the hemp industry, especially finished products and quote CBD products, because the vast majority of these sales are done online. And so the industry heavily relies on payment processors to conduct these transactions. And a lot of these clients have seen, or not just my clients, but the industry in general has seen their accounts shut down. So there are obviously some loopholes in terms of how people are defining their products using the term hemp versus CBD, or specifically naming a cannabinoid. Although I don't particularly recommend that, but that's one strategy. And another thing that I think is key also within that industry is to understand that anybody should have more than one account, because seeing your account shut down is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so people, for attorneys who are listening to this, or people in the industry, I'd say that one of the best things you can do is to have several accounts. So at the very least, if one of them shuts down, then you can still continue your business activities. It's not ideal. There are obviously a lot of losses involved, but for the time being, that's the most elegant thing that can be done in this imperfect regulatory scheme.
Excellent. Okay. I thought we covered a lot of ground on financial. Let's just do one more piece of that, which is related. Is this 280E issue in terms of the deduction of business expenses? So anybody want to lead that off? I'll look for a show of hands, and I'll give preference to Sahar, who's been quiet for a little bit. You want to come back in on this, Sahar?
Sure.
All right.
I'll give the basis of what 280E is and how it now unfortunately applies to cannabis, with the caveat that I am not a tax attorney. That's way beyond my pay grade.
Noted.
Just enough to make ourselves dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's way beyond my pay grade. I stop at simple M&A, whatnot. So 280E was introduced into the tax code to really deal with the cocaine kingpins. And it was brought in to make sure that folks who were dealing in illegal substances couldn't subtract the cost of doing business essentially from their taxes like a quote unquote normal business can. And so back in the day when we were applying it to the cocaine kingpins, it made perfect sense. However, because 280E covers all federally illegal substances, all of the Schedule I substances that have no recognized medical or other uses, it nowadays also applies in largely the same exact manner to cannabis businesses, even those who are state licensed and operating in not just material, but complete and utter compliance with the applicable regulations to them, which means that cannabis businesses, aside from very, very minor exceptions, cannot deduct the cost of doing business when it comes to their taxes, which ultimately boils down to, although there's revenue coming in large amounts, as we discussed when we were talking about banking, the profitability of these businesses is actually very, very low because the taxes that they have to pay just on the federal side alone, taking out the state taxes, the local taxes, and whatever other special taxes apply to them as a cannabis business, wherever they're situated, are very, very high, disproportionately higher than with a non-cannabis business. And so 280E essentially doesn't allow for a cannabis business, because it is federally illegal, to subtract the cost of doing business, which every other business in the United States gets to take advantage of.
That's great. By the way, like your level of concentration with the alarm going off is impressive. I would have taken a baseball bat to that thing.
I'm so sorry. I don't know why that's happening. I apologize.
You're doing a great job. Okay, so
I
anybody else have any thoughts on this? Yes, Lauren, go ahead.
I do actually. I want to piggyback on that because the IRS is getting increasingly sophisticated when it comes to auditing cannabis structures. And there's been some very important rulings. So, like Sahar said, it's, cannabis businesses cannot deduct ordinary business expenses. They can deduct things like cost of goods sold, and then it becomes a challenge depending on how aggressive of a tax position you want to take and how to properly categorize things. And, basically the further up you are the supply chain, the more, or, I guess when you're on the production side, I should say, you have more cost of goods sold. When you're on the retail side, you have less cost of goods sold, of course, depending on your business model. And that varies widely. And again, I know just enough about this to make myself dangerous. But what you do see is, cannabis businesses sort of creating affiliated entities, a real estate holdco, an intellectual property holdco, maybe a payroll employee holdco, and then lease or, license various assets to the company so that they can deduct ordinary business expenses from those holdcos. But the IRS is onto this, and they're seeing if there's parallel ownership and similar control, they'll just collapse all those entities together for IRS tax purposes, and then still, not allow you to deduct your ordinary, business expenses. So, if you do create related entities, very important to have, differing ownership, different management, really respect the corporate form, intercompany agreements, arm's length transactions, market terms, that sort of thing, and make sure that you've got a really defensible position for separateness, and that you're not just trying to take advantage of, or trying to get out of your 280E obligation.
Excellent. Anybody else on this topic? We've got a question in the chat, and then we can hit IP issues before we finish up. But anybody else want to say anything on the business expenses piece?
I just maybe want to say something that might be obvious, but I'm not sure it is, given some of my clients' reactions when we tell them this. But the fact that cannabis businesses cannot deduct their ordinary business expenses doesn't mean that they should not file tax returns, because their earnings are actually taxable income. And so I think that's really important to remind people engaged in the industry that while it's unfair that they don't get to deduct these expenses, they still have a tax liability.
Yeah, no, it's really surprising how many business owners, cannabis or otherwise, forget that piece of it. We got a question from the chat, which I think is interesting. And Jeff, I'll kick this to you to start with. So Marshall asks, it seems that the core issue is lobbying for federal legislation to remove marijuana from Schedule I drugs. Are there people within the industry lobbying that effort in Congress? I don't know if you know that, Jeff, but if you want to speak to that a little bit to start out with, I think that's interesting.
It's a massive question. Whoever answers it, however it's answered, you can go in so many different directions. There's stuff live right now. I believe it's called the MORE Act. The attorneys on the panel will do a better job of describing it than me. But in general, my personal thought, and just in the current administration, I don't think we have movement for the next couple of years. Is I think the general consensus from the industry people, from a federal standpoint. And I think beyond the Schedule I, it's also the focus on safe banking, which touches and a lot of the financial things that we're talking about. So being able to bank with FDIC insured banks, and that also touches something on the insurance side called the Claims Act, which is similar, and it basically prohibits admitted insurance carriers from working in this space. And so, again, it's a tough question. And it's something that I personally roll my eyes at, because there's been so much news about it, and there's starts and stops. And I personally believe that for me to do a good job for my clients and be an industry supporter, I need to focus on the now, because it's been going on. It's been a dragged out thing. And again, the general consensus from my review is that although there's noise being made and there has been progress, that I still don't think there's enough bipartisan support to get it done within this administration. I would love to hear what the attorneys have to say about it, but that's my high level.
All right, which attorney would like to go first? Sahar, you want to start off?
Sure. In an ideal world, cannabis legalization would be at the forefront of legislators' thoughts, especially because it's such a bipartisan issue. And it's a no-brainer from so many different vantage points. Unfortunately, I have to side with Jeff and say that I still think even now, even with, the toothpaste not being able to be put back into the tube, we still are a couple of years away from seeing real federal movement. On the Safe Banking Act, we've seen it come and go. And I think the first time that it passed the House, I was so excited, thinking to myself, this is it. This is what I've been working for. And then it happened again. And now I just am like, well, it'll be nice if it passes. But in reality, we're seeing banks and credit unions already kind of act as if those that have gotten into this space. And so I think we're still a couple of years away, but I do think the fact that we are seeing so much growing support on the federal side, I think the fact that we are seeing this come up in very serious discussions and not just be, fringe movements by the odd congressperson there or, the outcast weird senator over here is really, really important. I think that growing support in and of itself, even if it doesn't yet mean federal legalization, is nonetheless key.
Great. Lauren, Nathalie, are you on board with that? You have different thoughts?
Mixed feelings.
Mixed feelings.
Very controversial. There's so many different things. My law firm, I was one of the lawyers that brought a very massive action against former Attorney General Jeff Sessions and the federal government in an effort to deschedule cannabis on constitutional grounds. And at the time, we had submission of the case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court before getting dismissed on a procedural technicality, and we didn't get writ of certiorari by the Supreme Court. But we did get a lot of amicus briefs submitted in support, including multiple members of Congress, about a dozen members of Congress. And one of the reasons why they thought the decision had to be made at the judicial level was because they believed that the MORE Act and safe banking and the new Mace bill and all of it is, well, at the time the Mace bill wasn't there, and that one actually has a lot of promise, the Republican bill of all things. But nonetheless, they believed that there were so many competing ideologies and opportunities to legalize cannabis in so many different ways that they weren't going to be able to all align behind one. And so therefore, the court should make this decision and decide that it is unconstitutional or whatever makes sense. But there's no question that, the toothpaste is sort of out of the tube, with everybody, in the United States practically living in a jurisdiction where cannabis is legal, and interstate commerce is going to become a thing. I think that we're going to start seeing interstate commerce sooner than later out of the Pacific Northwest, with interstate compacts and efforts when we really start seeing, decriminalization on a federal level, which could happen sooner. So optimistic and excited for the future, but agreed, it's probably still a couple of years away.
Nathalie?
To be honest, I don't have to say than that. I agree with
just mixed feelings, right?
It's just, I think we've just been talking about this for so long that those of us in the industry, it just feels like a broken record, and maybe we're all disenchanted by the whole process. But I would agree with Sahar that I think it is a step in the right direction and helping legitimize the industry. And I think we can see progress, certainly, but ultimately, I also share everybody's thoughts that this is not going to happen this year. And in fact, it's going to take a little while longer.
Let's enter the potpourri section of the presentation. We got 2 minutes left. I want final thoughts from folks. And Nathalie, let's stay with you. Give me a final thought that people can take away here. We didn't talk about IP. We didn't talk about merger and acquisition. We had so many financing questions. You can talk about that briefly. You can talk about anything you want. Open-ended. 30 seconds, final thoughts.
I think that the industry is not going anywhere, and it's certainly an exciting world to be a part of. I think that we're just, especially to attorneys who are listening today, I think that this is a space that you should know enough about to be dangerous and to be able to refer people out, but appreciate that it's very complex. And so if you're new to it, just talk with other people in the industry like myself or other panelists who have been doing this for a while to educate yourself, because it's a very unique industry, and don't assume that it's regulated like any other regulated industry.
Fair. That's great. Jeff, final thoughts from you, sir.
Yeah, I think, again, an exciting time. I would categorize this, and I think industry has called this Cannabis 3.0. where there's massive M&A, there's new states coming on. It's it's such an exciting business. I also think the lack of federal legalization creates opportunities for smaller firms like an Embroker, where we're a startup company and we've been able to really dive into the niche. And I think similar to law firms and other businesses looking at the industry, it's a unique opportunity before the truly, massive pharma and CPG and banks and tobacco really dip their toes in. They're already there. They're already kind of involved, but I think that the time is now to get involved. So yeah, exciting business, and buckle your seatbelt if you want to jump in.
Excellent. We'll go Lauren and then Sahar.
Yeah, I think in New York, the more lawyers are coming online. We learned so much from our Colorado, California, Oregon, Washington counterparts. I really look forward to interacting with them as much as we can. But we need more lawyers, please, join the cannabis industry. We need sophisticated, smart, creative, talented lawyers to support this industry, to support the participants in the industry. There are a lot of new creative businesses coming online and many, many jobs being created, and lots of different players and stakeholders need protection. And so there is a lot of opportunity. The work is there. And so we just need more smart minds to join us, because obviously can't be on both sides of any deal. Obviously there's conflicts about. So just, invite you, to join the network and do more work and do good work, and let's push this industry forward, because we really are gatekeepers to some respect.
I love it. All right, Sahar, you get the last word. What do you got for us?
Just that cannabis industry is no longer just a tiny niche subset. It's here to stay, it's here to grow. If you have, to the attorneys that are listening, if you have a client that has a cannabis question, find good cannabis co-counsel to help you with it, because chances are a Google search won't give you all of the answers, and it certainly won't give you all of the questions that you should be asking. It's nuanced, it's state by state, it's locality by locality, and it is complex. And so find yourself a good cannabis co-counsel, because chances are you're gonna have more and more clients, irrespective of whatever industry it is that you're working in, that are going to come to you with continuing and complex cannabis related and also hemp related questions.
Excellent. We're a couple minutes past the hour. I see some questions in the chat. We're not going to be able to get to those, but we could forward those to the appropriate folks on the panel. Thanks for our panel today. That was really exciting. I learned a lot personally. Thanks to Embroker for presenting this program in association with Above the Law. Let me remind you that you've got some materials that you can access. You've got a handout available to you, as well as a link to more resources in the message page. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to everybody for listening. Hopefully we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.